Okay, so then Doreen can start, right? So I can let people in.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go, guys.
Thank you, Doreen, and welcome everybody to Learning and Mending. We're going to start this evening as we're all getting into our Zoom boxes with our embroidery of the week, and I'm really excited to share this beauty. This was done by Andrea Martinez, and I have to tell you, it's truly spectacular. I love the use of the red and the different textures that she used to enhance the bison. And then she did a little sparkle in the cloud. Hopefully she's here. And now what we're going to do is move into a kind of a popcorn introduction. So we'll say our name, our pronouns, where we're zooming in, and what we're working on tonight. We'll just pass it around for a couple minutes so we all get to know each other. I'll start. I'm Jen. I use she, her pronouns. I'm zooming in Studio City. And tonight I will be working on this design that is our new pattern. Let's see, can you see it? It's Metaphysical Blueprint by Vanetta Rendler. And I am slowly getting there. Right now I'm just doing the outline. And I will pass it to Jasmine.
Hi, my name is Jasmine Yende. I am zooming in from East Hollywood. And right now I'm making a scarf for one of my mentor friend persons who's having a cold right now. So I'm trying to make her a little scarf. So that's what I'm doing right now. Yeah, thank you. And I'll pass it over to Matt.
Hi, I'm Matt Hegan. I'm also zooming in from East Hollywood. And tonight I'm excited for the reading that was selected by Izzy. I'll pass it over to Kyle.
Hey, I'm Kyle. I am based in the East Bay.
in the Bay Area, and yeah, also just listening tonight and reading along with you all. And I will pass it to Sylvia.
Thank you. I'm Sylvia Holmes. I'm in Pasadena, California. She, her pronouns. I should probably do my physical therapy exercises, but if not, I will grab my embroidery from a couple of times ago, and I will pass it on to Jessie.
I'm Jesse. I'm in Morongo Valley near Joshua Tree. And I attended the first meeting and I missed the next one. So I'm not quite sure what people are expecting right now. I'll pass it to Cynthia.
Hi, my name's Cindy. I'm calling in from West Covina, and I go by she, her, and I am working on a raven from 2 learning and mendings ago. I'm happy to be here, and I will pass it on to oh wait, Matt.
Did you pass it to me? I already went, Cynthia.
Oh, sorry. Okay,
Oh,
then
good.
let's go with Lee.
Hi, I'm Lee. Hi, I'm Lee Adams, and I'm calling in from Altadena, just above Pasadena. And I use she, her, and we. And I'm working on some draperies for my kitchen. I don't think you can see them, but I will be covering my doorways in Hawaiian bark cloth. And it takes every meeting so far to do this. And let me pass it on to Mauricio.
Hi everyone, I attend by him pronouns and I am zooming from Highland Park. I just moved to LA from Chicago to joining the Metabolic Studio for this year. I am honored to be here and happy, and it's my first meeting. I'm not embroidering anything yet, but I'm super into it. Oh, I will pass to um well, Lauren.
Oh, that was an easy one. Hi, Mauricio. I'm Lauren. I'm calling in from Topanga. I go by she, they pronouns, and I am going to be filing my nails. Inspired by Emily's hairdo last week. Personal care, learning and mending. I will pass it on to, is it Shen Shen?
Yep, it's Shen Shen. Thank you. Sorry, I joined a little late, so I don't know what the last part of the prompt is.
Oh, we're just introducing where we're calling in from, what our pronouns are, and whether we're working on any embroidery or any mending tonight.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
My name is Shen Shen. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm calling from San Jose up in Northern California. I am not working on anything in this call, although I did get a little embroidery kit of Frida Kahlo the other day. There's a lovely textile museum up here. So excited to be here. There's somebody who hasn't gone? Emily, to you.
I'll volunteer. Hello, everyone. Good to be with you here for the Tuesday Ritual. I'm calling in from Echo Park neighborhood of Los Angeles, not too far from the Los Angeles River. Here with my dogs Bucky and Lulu, who are very into the series as well. And I'm thinking about doing some drawing tonight. I haven't drawn anything in a while, so I was thinking it'd be nice to listen and perhaps draw something. May I pass it to Fiorella?
Buenas noches, everyone. I'm coming to you all from Unceded Ohlone territory, also known as San Francisco, California. I will be mending my health because I'm feeling under the water. So I'll be listening to all you lovely people be speaking on the call. I still want to be here. So yeah, thank you all for your presence. I will pass it on to, let me see. Andrea, have you gone?
I have not. Hello. Andrea calling from Windsor Square, Los Angeles. And I am happy that I finished my buffalo, which I think you all saw. And I'm going to be starting the new pattern. So very excited about that. She, her pronouns, and looking forward to the reading tonight. And also really excited about all the new faces and like continued new faces in the series. So that's been fun. And on that note, I'm going to try to find somebody who I don't know. Let's see. Tara, have you gone yet?
No, hi. I'm Tara Nelson. I'm in Rochester, New York. She, her pronouns. And tonight I'll be working on a lot of things, including my Deepest Wounds journal and listening and learning. And I'll pass it on to Kristen.
Hi, I'll turn some light on. My name's Kristen. I'm in Norristown, Pennsylvania. That's outside of Philadelphia. She, they pronouns, and I'm honestly, we're recovering from a long day of paid labor. We had a retreat today. And yeah, I just spent the day peering into the soul of bureaucracy, and I'm really happy to be here. It is truly a mending experience, and I'm just going to be listening and loving it. So thanks, y'all. I will pass it on to Brittany.
Hello, my heart skipped a little bit when you said my name. I am zooming in from Augusta, Georgia. My pronouns are she, her. I'm sitting in the dark right now, so that's why my camera's not on. And I still haven't sent my information for the little sewing kit or the embroidery kit, but I will hopefully working on some drawings while we are participating in this reading. So greetings to you all. Enjoy. Popcorn to
Actually, Brittany, I'll take it from here.
Okay.
And you will have an opportunity to get your embroidery kit. Just email us at info@metabolicstudio.org and we'll send that out to you. So welcome, everybody. If you haven't had an opportunity to introduce yourself tonight, there will be a chance later this evening during the discussion. Welcome again to our 10th series of Learning and Mending Understories. In this series, we'll be exploring ecologies of storytelling through speculative fiction. An understory is an underlying layer of vegetation beneath a forest canopy. In this series, we'll be thinking about the complex, vital stories that lie below and the subplots that nurture life in the shadows. Speculative fiction is a broad term that encompasses several different genres, from hard science fiction and fantasy to myth-making and folklore. The underlying characteristic of speculative fiction is that it speculates. It asks, what if? Speculative fiction plays with what is and imagines what could be. Understories does not ponder possibilities that lie in some distant future, but imagines new ways of being present. We will investigate what speculative fiction is, how it disrupts time, and challenges anthropocentric visions of life and the transformative potential it offers. In this series, our embroidery collection features a new design by Vanetta Rendler. If you'd like one of these or one of the other patterns, please send us your mailing address to info@metabolicstudio.org. Tonight, we'll share our screen displaying this week's reading. Feel free to jump in and read aloud from the text as you feel inspired, as we welcome everyone to listen and give voice to the texts we share each week. And now I will pass it over to Izzy for tonight's explanation of our text.
You, Jen. Welcome everyone. I'm Izzy. So this week we will be reading Speech Sounds by Octavia Butler. Little background on Octavia Butler. She was born in 1947 in Pasadena, and she passed away in 2006 and was a renowned Black science fiction writer. She's personally one of my favorite science fiction writers or speculative fiction writers. My favorite of her works are Kindred and Parable of the Sower. And her work offers fierce critiques of society, particularly society as it's organized hierarchically, while presenting visions of alternative communities. And the untraditional communities or social arrangements she presents challenge identity construction. So often she's complicating race and gender and sexuality and multispeciality in her texts. And before we get into that, just to give a kind of like overview of how we got here, there are two themes that we have touched upon the past few weeks that carry through into this week's reading, which are language and the body. And we've explored the theme of the body through bodily hybridity between human, animal, and machine. And language and communication as ways of relating are elaborated upon or articulated through the body. So even a body of work, to think about the body like very broadly, even a body of work or a piece of speculative fiction text communicates something. And within that body of work may be a story like, say, the author of the Acacia Seeds, which we read in week 2 of the series, which is a short story in which ants leave messages in acacia seeds, and a story that lets imagination be expressed in the territories of non-human language, where translation is always impossible, and thus the possibility remains endless. Then there are also the never-ending stories of the carrier bag theory of fiction. For those of you that don't know what I'm referring to when I say that, this was a text we read in the first week, and we've continued to touch upon. And it's a theory that Ursula Le Guin presents, building off of Elizabeth Fisher's model of the carrier bag theory of evolution, that argues that the first tool created was not a phallic spear or weapon, it was a bag, like a carrier bag to put things in. So we've been thinking about the story as kind of a bag or a vessel that you can put seeds and food and a baby and whatever else in, like from that basis, that understanding. So to touch back to the themes of language and the body, last week we read 2 ecological fancies and an excerpt from Cyborg Manifesto. And these texts kind of exemplified ways in which fiction can obscure the lines between categories of embodiment, so human, animal, machine. And 2 ecological fancies presented 2 worlds that face collapse due to the halting of bodily or like productivity. So in one of the worlds, carrots go on strike and refuse to germinate, and this leads to a mass plant uprising. And even the GMO seeds couldn't take root. And in the other world,
we lose?
I think Izzy might be frozen.
Yeah.
Should we go ahead and begin with the reading?
I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, let's do that. I'll start us off. I just wanted to remind everybody that usually in this series, we take it in turns to read, and you read as long as you want. And then when you feel like stopping, stop, and the next person will pick up. And I'm sure Izzy will be back soon to fill in the gaps in her brilliant mind and her brilliant sentences. Speech Sounds by Octavia Butler. There was trouble aboard the Washington Boulevard bus. Rye had expected trouble sooner or later in her journey. She had put off going until loneliness and hopelessness drove her out. She believed she might have one group of relatives left alive, a brother and his 2 children 20 miles away in Pasadena. That was a day's journey one way if she were lucky. The unexpected arrival of the bus as she left her Virginia road home had seemed to be a piece of luck until the trouble began. 2 young men were involved in a disagreement of some kind, or more likely a misunderstanding. They stood in the aisle, grunting and gesturing at each other, each in his own uncertain T-stance as the bus lurched over the potholes. The driver seemed to be putting some effort into keeping them off balance. Still, their gestures stopped just short of contact, mock punches, hand games of intimidation to replace lost curses. People watched the pair, then looked at one another and made some anxious sounds. 2 children whimpered. Rye sat a few feet behind the disputants and right across from the back door. She watched the 2 carefully, knowing the fight would begin when someone's nerve broke or someone's hand slipped or someone came to the end of his limited ability to communicate. These things could happen anytime. One of them happened as the bus hit an especially large pothole, and one man, tall, thin, and sneering, was thrown onto his shorter opponent. Instantly, the shorter man drove his left fist into the disintegrating sneer. He hammered his larger opponent as though he neither had nor needed any weapon other than his left fist. He hit quickly enough, hard enough to batter his opponent down before the taller man could regain his balance or hit back even once. People screamed or squawked in fear. Those nearby scrambled to get out of the way. 3 more young men roared in excitement and gestured wildly. Then somehow a second dispute broke out between 2 of these 3, probably because one inadvertently touched or hit the other. As the second fight scattered frightened passengers, a woman shook the driver's shoulder and grunted as she gestured towards the fighting.
The driver grunted back through bared teeth. Frightened, the woman drew away. Rye, knowing the methods of bus drivers, braced herself and held onto the crossbar of the seat in front of her. When the driver hit the brakes, she was ready, and the combatants were not. They fell over seats and onto screaming passengers, creating even more confusion. At least one more fight started. The instant the bus came to a full stop, Rye was on her feet, pushing the back door. At the second push, it opened, and she jumped out, holding her pack in one arm. Several other passengers followed, but some stayed on the bus. Buses were so rare and irregular now. People rode when they could, no matter what. There might not be another bus today or tomorrow. People started walking, and if they saw a bus, they flagged it down. People making intercity trips like Rise from Los Angeles to Pasadena made plans to camp out or risk seeking shelter with locals who might rob or murder them. The bus did not move, but Rye moved away from it. She intended to wait until the trouble was over and get on again. But if there was shooting, she wanted the protection of a tree. Thus, she was near the curb when a battered blue Ford on the other side of the street made a U-turn and pulled up in front of the bus. Cars were rare these days, as rare as a severe shortage of fuel and relatively unimpaired mechanics could make them. Cars that still ran were as likely to be used as weapons as they were to serve as transportation. Thus, when the driver of the Ford beckoned Rye, she moved away wearily. The driver got out, a big man, young, neatly bearded, with dark, thick hair. He wore a long overcoat and a look of weariness that matched Rye's. She stood several feet from him, waiting to see what he would do. He looked at the bus, now rocking with the combat inside, then at the small cluster of passengers who had gotten off. Finally, he looked at Rye again.
She returned his gaze, very much aware of the old .45 automatic her jacket concealed. She watched his hands. He pointed with his left hand toward the bus. The dark tinted windows prevented him from seeing what was happening inside. His use of the left hand interested Rye more than his obvious question. Left-handed people tended to be less impaired, more reasonable and comprehending, less driven by frustration, confusion, and anger. She imitated his gesture, pointing toward the bus with her own left hand, then punching the air with both fists. The man took off his coat, revealing a Los Angeles Police Department uniform, complete with baton and service revolver. Rye took another step back from him. There was no more LAPD, no more any large organization, governmental or private. There were neighborhood patrols and armed individuals. That was all.
The man took something from his coat pocket, then threw the coat into the car. Then he gestured Rye back toward the rear of the bus. He had something made of plastic in his hand. Rye did not understand what he wanted until he went to the rear door of the bus and beckoned her to stand there. She obeyed mainly out of curiosity. Cop or not, maybe he could do something to stop the stupid fighting. He walked around the front of the bus to the street side where the driver's window was open. There, she thought she saw him throw something into the bus. She was still trying to peer through the tinted glass when people began stumbling out the rear door, choking and weeping. Gas. Rye caught an old woman who would have fallen, lifted two little children down when they were in danger of being knocked down and trampled. She could see the bearded man helping people at the front door. She caught a thin old man shoved out by one of the combatants. Staggered by the old man's weight, she was barely able to get out of the way as the last of the young men pushed his way out. This one, bleeding from nose and mouth, stumbled into another, and they grappled blindly, still sobbing from the gas. The bearded man helped the bus driver out through the front door, though the driver did not seem to appreciate his help. For a moment, Rye thought there would be another fight. The bearded man stepped back and watched the driver gesture threateningly, watched him shout in wordless anger.
The bearded man stood still, made no sound, refused to respond to clearly obscene gestures. The least impaired people tended to do this, stand back unless they were physically threatened, and let those with less control scream and jump around. It was as though they felt it beneath them to be as touchy as they less comprehending. This was an attitude of superiority And that was the way people like the bus driver perceived it. Such superiority was frequently punished by beatings, even by death. Rye had close calls of her own. As a result, she never went unarmed. And in this world, where the only likely common language was body language, being armed was often enough. She had rarely had to draw her gun or even display it. The bearded man's revolver was on constant display. Apparently, that was enough for the bus driver. The driver spat in disgust, glared at the bearded man for a moment longer, then strode back to his gas-filled bus. He stared at it for a moment, clearly wanting to get in, but the gas was still too strong. Of the windows, only his tiny driver's window actually opened. The front door was open, but the rear door would not stay open unless someone held it. Of course, the air conditioning had failed long ago. The bus would take some time to clear. It was the driver's property, his livelihood. He had pasted old magazine pictures of items he would accept as fare on its sides. Then he would use what he collected to feed the family or to trade. If the bus did not run, he did not eat. On the other hand, the inside of his bus was torn apart by senseless fighting. He would not eat very well either. He was apparently unable to perceive this. All he could see was that it would be some time before he could use his bus again. He shook his fist at the bearded man and shouted. There seemed to be words in his shout, but Rye could not understand them. She said she did not know whether this was his fault or hers. She had heard so little coherent human speech for the past 3 years. She was no longer certain how well she recognized it, no longer certain of the degree of her own impairment. The bearded man sighed. He glanced toward his car, then beckoned to Rye. He was ready to leave, but he wanted someone from her first. No, he wanted her to leave with him, risk getting into his car in spite of his uniform. Law and order were nothing, not even words any longer. She shook her head in a universally understood negative, but the man continued to beckon. She waved him away. He was doing what the less impaired rarely did, drawing potentially negative attention to one another of his kind. People from the bus had begun to took at her. One of the men who had been fighting tapped another one on the arm, then pointed from the bearded man to Rye, and finally held up the first 2 fingers of his right hand as though giving 2/3 of a Boy Scout salute. The gesture was very quick, its meaning obvious even at a distance. She had been grouped with the bearded man. Now what?
The man who had made the gesture started towards her. She had no idea what he intended, but she stood her ground. The man was half a foot taller than she was and perhaps 10 years younger. She did not imagine she could outrun him, nor did she expect anyone to help her if she needed help. The people around her were all strangers. She gestured once, a clear indication to the man to stop. She did not intend to repeat the gesture. Fortunately, the man obeyed. He gestured obscenely and several other men laughed. Loss of verbal language had spawned a whole new set of obscene gestures. The men, with stark simplicity, had accused her of sex with the bearded man and had suggested she accommodate the other men present, beginning with him. Rai watched him wearily. People might very well stand by and watch if he tried to rape her. They would also stand and watch her shoot him. Would he push things that far? He did not. After a series of obscene gestures that brought him not closer to her, he turned contemptuously and walked away. And the burdened man still waited. He had removed his service revolver, holster and all. He beckoned again, both hands empty. No doubt his gun was in the car and within easy reach, but his taking it off impressed her. Maybe he was all right. Maybe he was just alone. She had been alone herself for 3 years. The illness had stripped her, killing her children one by one, killing her husband, her sister, her parents. The illness, if it was all illnesses, had cut even the living off from one another. As it swept over the country, people hardly had time to lay blame on the Soviets, though they were falling silent along with the rest of the world. On a new virus, a new pollutant, radiation, divine retribution, the illness was stroke swift in the way it cut people down and stroke-like in some of its effects, but it was highly specific. Language was always lost or severely impaired. It was never regained. Often there was also paralysis, intellectual impairment, death.
Rai walked toward the bearded man, ignoring the whistling and applauding of two of the young men and their thumbs up signs to the bearded man. If he had smiled at them or acknowledged them in any way, she would almost certainly have changed her mind. If she had let herself think of the possible deadly consequences of getting into a stranger's car, she would have changed her mind. Instead, she thought of the man who lived across the street from her. He rarely washed since his bout with the illness, and he had gotten into the habit of urinating wherever he happened to be. He had 2 women already, one tending each of his large gardens. They put up with him in exchange for his protection. He had made it clear that he wanted Rai to become his 3rd woman. She got into the car, and the bearded man shut the door. She watched as he walked around to the driver's door, watched for his sake because his gun was on the seat beside her, and the bus driver and a pair of young men had come a few steps closer. They did nothing, though, until the bearded man was in the car. Then one of them threw a rock. Others followed his example, and as the car drove away, several rocks bounced off harmlessly. When the bus was some distance behind them, Rai wiped sweat from her forehead and longed to relax. The bus would have taken her more than halfway to Pasadena. She would have had to only walk 10 miles. She wondered how far she would have to walk now, and wondered if walking a long distance would be her only problem.
At Figueroa and Washington, where the bus normally made a left turn, the bearded man stopped, looked at her, and indicated that she should choose a direction. When she directed him left and he actually turned left, she began to relax. If he was willing to go where she directed, perhaps he was safe. As they passed blocks of burned, abandoned buildings, empty lots, and wrecked or stripped cars, he slipped a gold chain over his head and handed it to her. The pendant attached to it was a smooth, glassy black rock, obsidian. His name might be Rock or Peter or Black, but she decided to think of him as Obsidian. Even her sometimes useless memory would retain a name like Obsidian. She handed him her own name symbol, a pin in the shape of a large golden stalk of wheat. She had brought it she had bought it long before the illness and the silence began. Now she wore it, thinking it was as close as she was likely to come to Rye. People like Obsidian who had not known her before probably thought of her as wheat. Not that it mattered. She would never hear her name spoken again. Obsidian handed her pin back to her. He caught her hand as she reached for it and rubbed his thumb over her calluses. He stopped at First Street and asked which way again. Then, after turning right as she had indicated, he parked near the music center. There, he took a folded paper from the dashboard and unfolded it. Rye recognized it as a street map, though the writing on it meant nothing to her. He flattened the map, took her hand again, and put her index finger on one spot. He touched her, touched himself, pointed toward the floor. In effect, we are here. She knew he wanted to know where she was going. She wanted to tell him, but she shook her head sadly. She had lost reading and writing. That was her most serious impairment and her most painful. She had taught history at UCLA. She had done freelance writing. Now she could not even read her own manuscripts. She had a house full of books that she could neither read nor bring herself to use as fuel. And she had a memory that would not bring back to her much of what she had read before. She stared at the map, trying to calculate. She had been born in Pasadena, had lived for 15 years in Los Angeles. Now she was near LA Civic Center. She knew the relative positions of the two cities, knew streets, directions, even knew to stay away from freeways, which might be blocked by wrecked cars and destroyed overpasses. She ought to know how to point out Pasadena, even though she could not recognize the word.
Hesitantly, she placed her hand over a pale orange patch in the upper right corner of the map. That should be right. Pasadena. Obsidian lifted her hand and looked under it, then folded the map and put it back on the dashboard. He could read, she realized belatedly. He could probably write too. Abruptly, she hated him. Deep, bitter hatred. What did literacy mean to him? A grown man who played cops and robbers? But he was literate and she was not. She never would be. She felt sick to her stomach with hatred, frustration, and jealousy. And only a few inches from her hand was a loaded gun. She held herself still, staring at him, almost seeing his blood, but her rage crested and ebbed, and she did nothing. Obsidian reached for her hand with hesitant familiarity. She looked at him. Her face had already revealed too much. No person still living in what was left of human society could fail to recognize that expression, that jealousy. She closed her eyes wearily, drew a deep breath. She had experienced longing for the past, hatred for the present, growing hopelessness, purposelessness, but she had never experienced such a powerful urge to kill another person. She had left her home finally because she had come near to killing herself. She had found no reason to stay alive. Perhaps that was why she had gotten into Obsidian's car. She had never before done such a thing. He touched her mouth and made chatter motions with thumb and fingers. Could she speak? She nodded and watched his milder envy come and go. But both had admitted what it was not safe to admit, and there had been no violence. He tapped his mouth and forehead and shook his head. He did not speak or comprehend spoken language. The illness had played with them, taking away, she suspected, what each valued most.
She plucked at his sleeve, wondering why he had decided on his own to keep the LAPD alive with what he had left. He was sane enough otherwise. Why wasn't he at home raising corn, rabbits, and children? But she did not know how to ask. Then he put his hand on her thigh, and she had another question to deal with. She shook her head. Disease, pregnancy, helpless, solitary agony. No. He massaged her thigh gently and smiled in obvious disbelief. No one had touched her for 3 years. She had not wanted anyone to touch her. What kind of world was this to chance bringing a child into, even if the father were willing to stay and help raise it?
It was too bad, though. Obsidian could not know how attractive he was to her. Young, probably younger than she was, clean, asking for what he wanted rather than demanding it. But none of that mattered. What were a few moments of pleasure measured against a lifetime of consequences? He pulled her closer to him, and for a moment she let herself enjoy the closeness. He smelled good, male and good. She pulled away reluctantly.
He sighed, reached out towards the glove compartment. She stiffened, not knowing what to expect, but all he took out was a small box. The writing on it meant nothing to her. She did not understand until he broke the seal, opened the box, and took out a condom. He looked at her, and she first looked away in surprise. Then she giggled. She could not remember when she had last giggled. He grinned, gestured towards the back seat, and she laughed out loud. Even in her teens, she had disliked back seats of cars, but she looked around at the empty streets and ruined buildings. Then she got out and into the back seat. He let her put the condom on him, then seemed surprised at her eagerness. Sometime later, they sat together, covered by his coat, unwilling to become clothed near strangers again just yet. He made rock the baby gestures and looked questioningly at her. She swallowed, shook her head. She did not know how to tell him her children were dead. He took her hand and drew a cross in it with his index finger, then he made his baby rocking gesture again. She nodded, held up 3 fingers, then turned away, trying to shut out a sudden flood of memories. She had told herself that the children growing up now were to be pitied. They would run through the downtown canyons with no real memory of what the buildings had been or even how they had come to be. Today's children gathered books as well as wood to be burned as fuel. They ran through the streets chasing one another and hooting like chimpanzees. They had no future. They were now all they would ever be.
He put his hand on her shoulder, and she turned suddenly, fumbling for a small box, then urging him to make love to her again. He could give her forgetfulness and pleasure. Until now, nothing had been able to do that. Until now, every day had brought her closer to the time when she would do what she had left home to avoid doing, putting her gun in her mouth and pulling the trigger. She asked Obsidian if he would come home with her, stay with her. He looked surprised and pleased once he understood, but he did not answer at once. Finally, he shook his head as she had feared he might. He was probably having too much fun playing cops and robbers and picking up women. She dressed in silent disappointment, unable to feel any anger toward him. Perhaps he had already had a wife and a home. That was likely. The illness had been harder on men than on women, had killed more men, had left male survivors more severely impaired. Men like Obsidian were rare. Women either settled for less or stayed alone. If they found an Obsidian, they did what they could to keep him. Rye suspected he had someone younger, prettier, keeping him.
He touched her while she was strapping her gun on and asked with a complicated series of gestures whether it was loaded. She nodded grimly. He patted her arm. She asked once more if he would come home with her, this time using a different series of gestures. He had seemed hesitant. Perhaps he could be courted. Got out and into the front seat without responding. She took her place in front again, watching him. Now he plucked at his uniform and looked at her. She thought she was being asked something, but didn't know what it was. He took off his badge, tapped it with one finger, then tapped his chest. Of course. She took the badge from his hand and pinned her wheat stalk to it. If playing cops and robbers was his only insanity, let him play. She would take him, uniform and all. It occurred to her that she might even eventually lose him to someone he would meet, as he had met her, but she would have him for a while. He took the street map down again, tapped it, pointed vaguely northeast toward Pasadena, then looked at her. She shrugged, tapped his shoulder, then her own, and held up her index and second fingers tight together, just to be sure. He grasped 2 fingers and nodded. He was with her. She took the map from him and threw it on the dashboard. She pointed back southwest, back toward home. Now she didn't have to go to Pasadena. Now she could go on having a brother there and 2 nephews, 3 right-handed males. Now she did not have to find out for certain whether she was as alone as she feared. Now she was not alone.
Obsidian took Hill Street south, then Washington west, and she leaned back, wondering what it would be like to have someone again. With what she had scavenged, what she had preserved, and what she grew, there was easily enough food for them. There was certainly room enough in a 4-bedroom house. He could move his possessions in. Best of all, the animal across the street would pull back and possibly not force her to kill him. Obsidian had drawn her closer to him, and she had put her head on his shoulder when suddenly he braked hard, almost throwing her off the seat. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw that someone had run across the street in front of the car. One car on the street, and someone had to run in front of it. Straightening up, Rye saw that the runner was a woman, fleeing from an old frame house to a boarded-up storefront. She ran silently, but the man who followed her a moment later shouted what sounded like garbled words as he ran. He had something in his hand. Not a gun. A knife, perhaps. The woman tried a door, found it locked, looked around desperately, finally snatched up a fragment of glass broken from the storefront window. With this, she turned to face her pursuer. Rye thought she would be more likely to cut her own hand than to hurt anyone else with the glass. Obsidian jumped from the car, shouting. It was the first time Rye had heard his voice, deep and hoarse from disuse. He made the same sound over and over the way some speechless people did. Da, da, da. Rye got out of the car as Obsidian ran toward the couple. He had drawn his gun. Fearful, she drew her own and released the safety. She looked around to see who else might be attracted to the scene. She saw the man glance at Obsidian, then suddenly lunge at the woman. The woman jabbed his face with her glass, but he caught her arm and managed to stab her twice before Obsidian shot him.
The man doubled, then toppled, clutching his abdomen. Obsidian shouted, then gestured Rye over to help the woman. Rye moved to the woman's side, remembering that she had little more than bandages and antiseptic in her pack. But the woman was beyond help. She had been stabbed with a long, slender boning knife. She touched Obsidian to let him know the woman was dead. He had bent to check the wounded man who lay still and also seemed dead. But as Obsidian looked around to see what Rye wanted, the man opened his eyes. Face contorted, he seized Obsidian's just holstered revolver and fired. The bullet caught Obsidian in the temple and he collapsed. It happened that just that simply, just that fast. An instant later, Rai shot the wounded man as he was turning the gun on her. And Rai was alone with 3 corpses.
She knelt beside Obsidian, dry-eyed, frowning, trying to understand why everything had suddenly changed. Obsidian was gone. He had died and left her like everyone else. 2 very small children came out of the house from which the man and woman had run, a boy and a girl, perhaps 3 years old. Holding hands, they crossed the street toward Rai. They stared at her, then edged past her and went to the dead woman. The girl shook the woman's arm as though trying to wake her. This was too much. Rai got up, feeling sick to her stomach with grief and anger. If the children began to cry, she thought she would vomit. They were on their own, those 2 kids. They were old enough to scavenge. She did not need any more grief. She did not need a stranger's children who would grow up to be hairless chimps. She went back to the car. She could drive home at least. She remembered how to drive. The thought that Obsidian should be buried occurred to her before she reached the car, and she did vomit. She had found and lost the man so quickly. It was as though she had been snatched from comfort and security and given a sudden, inexplicable beating. Her head would not clear. She could not think. Somehow, she made herself go back to him, look at him. She found herself on her knees beside him with no memory of having knelt. She stroked his face, his beard. One of the children made a noise, and she looked at them, at the woman who was probably their mother. The children looked back at her, obviously frightened. Perhaps it was their fear that reached her finally. She had been about to drive away and leave them. She had almost done it, almost left 2 toddlers to die. Surely there had been enough dying. She would have to take the children home with her. She would not be able to live with any other decision. She looked around for a place to bury the 3 bodies, or 2. She wondered if the murderer were the children's father. Before the silence, the police had always said some of the most dangerous calls they went out on were domestic disturbance calls. Obsidian should have known that. Not that the knowledge would have kept him in the car. It would not have held her back either. She could not have watched the woman murdered and done nothing.
She dragged Obsidian toward the car. She had nothing to dig with her and no one to guard for her while she dug. Better to take the bodies with her and bury them next to her husband and her children. Obsidian would come home with her after all. When she had gotten him onto the floor in the back, she returned for the woman. The little girl, thin, dirty, solemn, stood up and unknowingly gave Rai a gift. As Rai began to drag the woman by her arms, the little girl screamed, "No." Rai dropped the woman and stared at the girl. "No," the girl repeated. She came to stand beside the woman. "Go away," she told Rai. "Don't talk," the little boy said to her. There was no blurring or confusion of sounds. Both children had spoken, and Rai had understood. The boy looked at the dead murderer and moved further from him. He took the girl's hand. "Be quiet," he whispered.
Fluent speech. Had the woman died because she could talk and had taught her children to talk? Had she been killed by a husband's festering anger or by a stranger's jealous rage? And the children, they must have been born after the silence. Had the disease run its course then? Or were these children simply immune? Certainly they had had time to fall sick and silent. Rai's mind leaped ahead. What if children of 3 or fewer years were safe and able to learn language? What if all they needed were teachers and protectors? Rai glanced at the dead murderer. To her shame, she thought she could understand some of the passions that must have driven him, whoever he was. Anger, frustration, hopelessness, insane jealousy. How many more of him were there? People willing to destroy what they could not have. Obsidian had been the protector, had chosen that role for who knew what reason. Perhaps putting on an obsolete uniform and patrolling the empty streets had been what he did instead of putting a gun into his mouth. And now that there was something worth protecting, he was gone. She had been a teacher, a good one. She had been a protector too, though only of herself. She had kept herself alive when she had no reason to live. If the illness let these children alone, she could keep them alive. Somehow she lifted the dead woman into her arms and placed her on the back seat of the car. The children began to cry, but she knelt on the broken pavement and whispered to them, fearful of frightening them with the harshness of her long, unused voice. It's all right, she told them. You're going with us too. Come on. She lifted them both, one in each arm. They were so light. Had they been getting enough to eat? The boy covered her mouth with his hand, but she moved her face away. It's all right for me to talk, she told him. As long as no one's around, it's all right. She put the boy down on the front seat of the car, and he moved over without being told to make room for the girl. When they were both in the car, Rye leaned against the window, looking at them, seeing that they were less afraid now, that they watched her with at least as much curiosity as fear. I'm Valerie Rye, she said, savoring the words. It's all right for you to talk to me.
Afterword. Speech Sounds was conceived in weariness, depression, and sorrow. I began the story feeling little hope or liking for the human species. But by the time I reached the end of it, my hope had come back. It always seems to do that. Here's the story behind Speech Sounds. In the early 1980s, a good friend of mine discovered that she was dying of multiple myeloma, an especially dangerous, painful form of cancer. I had lost elderly relatives and family friends to death before this, but I had never lost a personal friend. I had never watched a relatively young person die slowly and painfully of disease. It took my friend a year to die, and I got into the habit of visiting her every Saturday and taking along the latest chapter of the novel I was working on. This happened to be Clay's Ark. With its story of disease and death, it was thoroughly inappropriate for the situation. But my friend had always read my novels. She insisted that she wanted to read this one as well. I suspect that neither of us believed she would live to read it in its completed form, although, of course, we didn't talk about this. I hated going to see her. She was a good person. I loved her, and I hated watching her die. Nevertheless, every Saturday I got on a bus, I don't drive, and went to her hospital room or her apartment. She got thinner and frailer and querulous with pain. I got more depressed.
One Saturday, as I sat on a crowded, smelly bus, trying to keep people from stepping on my ingrown toenail and trying not to think of terrible things, I noticed trouble brewing just across from me. One man had decided he didn't like the way another man was looking at him. Didn't like it at all. It's hard to know where to look when you're wedged in a place on a crowded bus. The wedged-in man argued that he hadn't done anything wrong, which he hadn't. He inched toward the exit as though he meant to get himself out of a potentially bad situation. Then he turned and edged back into the argument. Maybe his own pride was involved. Why the hell should he be the one to run away? This time, the other guy decided that it was his girlfriend sitting next to him who was being looked at inappropriately. He attacked.
The fight was short and bloody. The rest of us, the other passengers, ducked and yelled and tried to avoid being hit. In the end, the attacker and his girlfriend pushed their way off the bus. fearful that the driver would call the police. And the guy with the pride sagged, dazed and bloody, looking around as though he wasn't sure what had happened. I sat where I was, more depressed than ever, hating the whole hopeless, stupid business, and wondering whether the human species would ever grow up enough to learn to communicate without using fists of one kind or another. The first line of a possible story came to me. There was trouble aboard the Washington Boulevard bus.
Matt, do you have the other small short text to screen share? If not, I can put it up really quickly. Oh, thank you. Excerpt from.
Go ahead.
Oh no, Lauren, you go ahead.
Excerpt from Afterwards on Octavia Butler's Speech Sounds by Nikita Gale. The least impaired people tended to stand back unless they were physically threatened and let those with less control scream and jump around. It was as though they felt it beneath them to be as touchy as the less comprehending. This was an attitude of superiority, and that was the way people perceived it. Such superiority was frequently punished by beatings, even by death. And in this world, the only likely common language was body language, speech sounds.
Speech sounds places us in a world of bodies. The bodies in this world whistle and applaud. They scream and squawk and roar and whimper. They all seem to carry guns. Facial expressions disintegrate as bodies throw punches, fuck, spit, cry, and bleed out in the wake of mundane eruptions of the violence of misunderstanding. Emotions are harbored and silent: disappointment, jealousy, anger, fear. Communication has retreated to the visible body. That space between bodies formerly designated for speech and listening has been removed entirely. Language has been replaced by paroxysm and elaborate physical gestures that stop just short of contact. In this world, the body is the word and text by which meaning is produced and received. People find themselves in a valley of semiotic strangeness, where bodies no longer dispatch language and symbols, but have become the symbols themselves. It is fascinating to observe how Butler chooses to describe the characters in this world. While vague references to height and age and facial hair are sometimes provided, the attribute of color is only applied to inanimate materials, some of which become devices by which characters are identified.
Hey, thank you, everyone. I know that was a long, intense text, so I really appreciate everyone's patience and participation. Sorry for me being cut off earlier. I had more to say about what we've done so far, but now that feels kind of irrelevant, and I'll do that again next week. So for this week's questions, I just want to speak briefly to something Nikita Gale said from the piece we just read from her, but from a different part of the text. So she writes that speech sounds invites us to think about what happens to society when it loses a tool that not only locates a subject in relation to others, but is also such as a naturalized marker of identity. So we get to imagine what happens in the wake of an abrupt and traumatic biological event and contemplate new modes of relation that determine how we are understood, how we understand one another. We're prompted to ask ourselves who we are without language. And in this way, the metaphor of language essentially becomes a project of decolonialization. So the death of language is painful only in the loss of the familiar, but it's also an opening for new forms of relation to emerge. It prompts the idea that some brief and painful event might make possible the destruction of the more prolonged violence of language and of other dominant systems as they now exist. So my questions for this week are, what possible arrangements can emerge from the collapse of institutions that attempt to render us speechless or unable to recognize each other? And what does a loss of discursive space do? And what does a space of relation look like beyond or before language? So I'll put those in the chat. And also, if anyone else has just random thoughts on the piece, wants to say something about how it relates to speculative fiction generally, Los Angeles pandemic, there's a lot of different things that you could pick up on in this text, but those are just some guiding questions I came up with if you want to touch on them. So I'll open the floor to discussion.
Wow. That is a bold piece of writing. And, Izzy, thank you so much for bringing that to us this week. I've been listening on Audible to a book by Robert McFarlane called Underland. And one of the things that he brings up is that we're the first generation, especially in North America, where we don't know where we're going to be buried. Like all through like the history of time, people have known where their bones would be buried. And that sense of place, that sense of belonging is something that this piece of writing kind of brought up for me, that in the loss of language, there's also the reemergence of embodiment. And so much of the action in this text is about loss, and then the complexity that Rai has about retrieving the bodies of Obsidian and the people who were murdered and wanting to bury them and put them in the ground. So one of the things that really came up for me in this writing is the kind of primal idea that our home is the earth. And the idea that we ultimately, the last act, the sort of sacrament of burial, and the last negotiation before Obsidian's death being the kind of cross in the hand and the rocking of the baby, the kind of birth and death narrative without words. It's very ingrained in the kind of collective psyche.
Yeah, I agree with you, Lauren. The loss and death and that's present in this. I mean, it like last week when we read Two Ecological Fancies, and there was this loss of like people were unable to have babies. And what happened when people were unable to have babies was that like the industrial system just shut down. And same with the carrots, like when they decided to not germinate. And even with Cyborg Manifesto, it's like there was something off with the embodiment of the cyborg that then met, there's a line that Haraway says that the cyborg is not loyal to its makers, basically. And so to think about like when there's a shift in embodiment, when there's something like a virus that plagues people and they lose capacity for speech or whatever it is, it's like there's an impact that happens directly to industry and to institutions. And like in this story, I think in Two Ecological Fancies, it said like the military shut down, all these things shut down. And in this story, it's like there's no police except this kind of funny fake police, which almost feels like a roast of police too. And so there's something just about like a connection to like virus and industry almost, and that it's kind of like the earth looking out for us in this other way too, where it's like we're gonna have a virus step in to make other things like, I don't know, like an actual check on social things that are happening. And I think that feels, what was I gonna say? There was one more thing relevant in, I'm forgetting. Yeah, I'm forgetting what what I was gonna say, but that the collapse that comes. Oh, also with COVID, like people had to stop working, and then that opened up space for like uprisings to happen and for people to actually like be able to protest and like push back against industry as well. So yeah.
To your point of the dissolution of institutions like police, the commentary on the uniform I thought was interesting, because how people dress and project themselves is a form of language, you could argue, because there's still this sort of projection of an idea just from how somebody carries themselves or what they're wearing, or and in a world where there is no, when you don't have this like vital tool that we use for thinking, exchange then becomes about that sort of projected sense of security, or whether like physical protection or food or sex or any, you know, all those base things. And so much of the way we think in language lets us like, I guess, also project and like imagine things. Or I think, at least personally, a lot of imagination is in language in a way. And so part of what's so heartbreaking at the end, when before Obsidian dies, is that Rye has this whole like daydream of what their future might look like, and sort of picturing like what the future might be, and sort of living in that for a moment, but then having it ripped away, I thought was really painful, but also maybe is related to the language thing. And it reminded me a tiny bit of the story of the Tower of Babel, because I think some people compare LA to like a Babylonia in its sort of in its excess, but obviously in that biblical tale, people's language gets disrupted by God as like a punishment, and then everyone's words are garbled and they can't understand each other anymore, and so then they all disperse and they like scatter. And so I wonder if that perhaps inspired anything for Octavia Butler.
I wanted to add something, and this is like somewhat connected. The keynote speaker at this past weekend's LA Mushroom Festival talked about language and smell, and particularly the lack of language in mycology to use as descriptors for identifying mushrooms. And one of the things that the keynote speaker highlighted was different cultures that used language particularly to, language to associate smell with certain times of year, certain places, certain organisms. There was like over 12,000 different words for smell that were associated in this way. And I just thought that was interesting, going towards, they're talking about the need to create collective language and sort of key in these different things that we really have nothing for, even just making up words themselves. And I also find that, going back to the point of the collapse of institutions, because there's sort of this like transformation going on in the mycological community where it's been very guarded and gate kept by academia for a really, really long time, and sort of suppressive of embracing local enthusiasts, everyday people. And so there's sort of this transformation now that's accepting more community science in this way, or just communities and their own languages for it. And so part of what is blossoming from that is this ability to create language. I mean, even the word oftentimes you use the word colonization to describe mushrooms growing on things, and it's taken a long fight. It's like a horrible word, obviously for many reasons, like, but it's taken a long time to even just switch that from colonization to myceliate, which is a verb for fungusing. So anyways.
When I was right now, I'm like working on this like long series of workshop body of knowledge thing about this concept I'm working with called Black ancestral wisdom, and just like looking at texts from Black writers, looking at texts and like thinking about like what are the like underlying, like, I don't know, like there's this rule, like there's this underlying rule to like some of the universes that she creates, Octavia Butler, in my opinion. And I think like for this one, it's like this lesson of what happens when survival happens without processing, like language as this space where we process what happens to us. Like the character just going through so much and just experiencing pain after pain after pain, but not ever having space to just like sit with it and just like look at what is going on, and just like the way that as Black people in America, like the violence just is so ongoing. Like, can language be our space of reprieve? Like, can language be that space? But I don't quite know, but like, I don't know. I'm just thinking about that. I'm just thinking about like how after an attack, you just have to, there's like no space to actually like look at and really just be with the devastation. It's always just a new survival. And I don't know, I think that this story really encapsulates that, what it does to a psyche, or like what it does to words, what it does to how we use the body as a communicator, you know, like even like the way the pleasure became this like weirdness for her. I don't know, I'm just like, yeah.
I think for me, like a couple of different things come up. I don't know anything about living in LA up here in the far, far north of California where it's all trees. But I live in like a community that like we actively like communalize all of our finances, all of our costs, and are always moving towards that, like even to the point where we encourage people to like quit their jobs if they need a break, etc. And we hope for the collapse of the institutions that are harming and oppressing us all and destroying the environment and killing us, and our languages and our cultures and our people. And I think about how in this effort to literally like prefigure politics and like rebuild our like own society and like communal culture within our like communal space, there is a loss of the discourses and the symbols that people use to navigate relationships as dictated by the society that we currently live in. So we're living together under a formulation that many people in the household have never envisioned for themselves. So even though we share like common verbal language, the actual like discursive understandings that we have of like our values and also our feelings and senses of self are continuously like challenged, and it becomes very like scary and frightening. And people often, as like I feel like in this text, will always have this sort of like risk of like leaning into like old tropes and old fears and being reactive, and like it's a very big like risk and like vulnerability to trust the sort of ways that we are trying to newly render ourselves comprehensible to each other, to hold each other and envision like pathways through relationships that maybe might not have been possible in cis heteronormative monogamous relations, etc. Not that we're all involved, although things can be exciting from time to time. I also think a lot about like, as like a Native Hawaiian person, like I feel like in indigenous spheres, we're always talking about the way when our languages are ripped from us. It's not just that we've lost a language or a religion, or we're losing language or religion. We're losing entire worldviews, entire ways of conceiving ourselves, plants, animals, others, spiritual energy. It's an entire like removal, not just of communication, but of like universe and self. And so I'm also like, I feel like that's also coming up for me. Pass.
I love what Max just said in relationship to the text. I'm teaching in a public school in Pasadena, where many children have been, all the children have been without education, public education for a couple of years, and are learning to use language and to learning what the norms are and how you get along in a classroom, to the point that I had a student this week who has not been in a school at all in his life and has no idea what to do, how to be, how to relate to other kids, teachers, authorities. It's creating a whole new everything for him, all structure that we consider, we've grown up in, we've experienced all our lives, is not there. And then add on to that the indigeneity and the loss of the core values of various cultures and language that express them, and the relationships to the earth that different peoples have, that those languages are critically important to express. And you look at COVID brought us down some notches, and we have an opportunity to rebuild, just as you're rebuilding with your group, new ways of relating and new ways of being. That's exciting.
Yeah, that's something, Lee, that I really appreciate about this text is how it presents loss, but then also new ways of relating and constructing relationships, which also we'll be reading about next week in a text called Deer Dancer by Kathleen Alcala, who this story I found in a anthology of speculative fiction called New Suns, and it's speculative fiction by people of color anthology. And this story is about kind of this person who goes into dream states and is living in like a commune after a post-climate collapse society, and is the dreamer for the commune. And then a short piece of prose by Jackie Wang, who's an abolitionist writer, called Coral Tree, and it's very short. And then also a poem by Joy Harjo called The Post-Colonial Tale. And all of those texts kind of think about dreaming, so that'll be the topic for next week. So kind of building off this week about like embodiment, we continue with embodiment, but through dreams and like dimensionality, multiple dimensionality, maybe, you know, I don't know, we got 3D, we got 4D, 5D, 6D, 7D, 1000D. We're going to explore all the dimensions. So yeah. Well, it's almost 7. I think I'll pass it to Laura now.
Yeah. Thank you, Izzy. What an extraordinary piece of writing, and what an extraordinary series you've crafted for us. Thank you so much. And thank you for all of your,
thank you.
all of your guiding questions. Yeah, lots to think about until we meet again next week. And also wanted to introduce our friend Doreen Kutska, who will be singing a little bit for us as we listen and sign off when you feel like it. Doreen is a Berlin-based artist who is interpreting yodeling for another generation. And I think of the yodel itself as an embodied pre-speech vocalization that is complex and simple at the same time, just like this story. So it couldn't really be a more perfect way to end this. And wanted to invite any of you who would like to workshop with Doreen. She will be at Metabolic Studio workshopping yodeling this Friday at 11 and the following Friday at 11. If anybody would like to come, we welcome you to join in. And she will also be part of a film screening in the park in Torrance on Saturday evening, and I'll put that link while she's singing into the chat bar. So thank you, Doreen, in advance for your contribution, and please join us, anybody who feels like it, Friday at 11 at Metabolic Studio.